Today we're going to take a look at the Parallax software from Neural DSP. Okay, so let's check it out, but beforehand, some methodology here. I'm not going to do a traditional walkthrough like I've done for some other softwares and things like that recently. Neural DSP has done an amazing job of kind of giving you every detail in a set of videos that get into every possible end of what you might need to know on it. So I definitely recommend checking out their channel if you want to really get into exacting detail. What I'm going to try and cover here are my thoughts on the overall approach I would use in something like this. And for me, as I've stated in some of the other videos about software, I'm always trying to take a little bit of a left turn with it. There's usually a specific sound that somebody or something the designer is known for that gets presented, and I'm always trying to see if we can carve out something a little different and see how far we can get into coming up with something a little different from what might be in the other demos. So I wanted to take a really simple approach and not go to extremes with it right away. You can hear in the playthrough, I went for a pretty traditional metal tone and tried to be fairly aggressive, something I might use myself normally. And so let's start there. I'll show you how I got it. I didn't use a lot of processing. I kind of wanted to see what the tonality was straight out of the box, and then also take a look at expanding that sound, trying a couple of different tones and that kind of thing, and seeing how the controls interact with each other. That's the biggest thing I noticed about this, is you can really spend a lot of time kind of going down a rabbit hole with this one because of how interactive the three different zones, especially of distortion and being able to raise and comparatively balance them against each other. So let's get into it and let's take a look. Okay, starting at the beginning, something that I feel is important to point out is to never forget about the importance of your gain staging. Now at this, with the input set at 0, this has an effect on how hard you're hitting and the coloration of what's being delivered to all of the bands. And I found this can have some great effects that you might not consider right up front. So this is the preset as it is for what I used in the demo. Sounds like this. Now, if I want a bit more clarity, or I want to dial off some of that distortion for a solo section, or just feel like it needs a bit more note individuation, just pulling that input back, I can keep the same overall color, but so if there's a solo bass section in it, or I just decide that I want the notes to cut a bit more exactly and not quite wash out as much with the distortion, that can keep it going right there with no further adjustment. So don't underestimate that, and use that as part of the tone coloring. I definitely feel like a lot of people may miss that step in it, as a lot of people do kind of forget about gain staging to begin with. So very cool thing, and something that I noticed right away that gave me, again, a lot more versatility in how to hit the unit and get a different sound out of it. Now, this preset is, again, what I used in the playthrough, and I wanted to keep it pretty simple, pretty straight. I didn't do a ton of adjustments. What we have is just a little bit of a bump in the mids, little dig out here, and then I raised it up for some of the highs to give it some cut and clarity, and same here on the graphic. But starting at the bottom with the low and the compression, always be aware that as you add in compression, you're going to have to raise the level. It definitely takes down some of the volume. So if you're starting down here, you're definitely going to need to compensate by bringing that up. So other than that, it's the band pass is what's really going to give you most of your sound here and shape how you use it, as far as how interactive it is with the other bands too, which we'll get to in just a second. With the mid, I feel like the mid is kind of the cut knob. It's surprisingly, a lot of times I'll go for upper mids or try and go for that sharper cut up in that region, but this one definitely makes the big difference in how you sit in the mix and how forward you are. So if this is the preset as is, just by raising that center, massive amount of difference in how much presence and how much space you're eating up in that mix. That's going to really kind of define, for me, your center. Don't underestimate that. For me, adding drive to the mids actually became more of a thing in some of the other tones I came up with, which is really different for me, because adding distortion to the mid was something I did more in this one, which is kind of uncommon for me. So it's a different approach immediately I had to look at when it came to the Parallax. Usually I'm going for distortion on top, cleaner on the bottom, and in the center mids, which is something I think a lot of people do. This one, however, because it's so focused and has such a cut, that was where I really kind of focused a lot more on my grind and put distortion in places I wouldn't normally think. So don't be afraid to kind of dial it in with your ears instead of your eyes. So, bringing the mids up and adding the drive, you're going to get a ton of cut out of it and still maintain that definition. So don't be afraid to play around with that. Now, again, showing a completely different approach than I would usually use, I kept the drive on the highs down a lot. I might even sink below that if I were using this on a different track. I found that the highs are really where your clarity comes from, and if you have it set about here. If I'm going and pulling this node back, which we're going to mess with these in a minute, I might add a bit more in it. But for me, this was really clarity on the top end, and keeping it down. It's what kept a little bit of the clank going and some more of the clarity that I'm usually looking for, not just to sit in and kind of wash out with the guitars. Now, the really interesting thing here, and the stuff that I think you'll experiment with the most, is going to be how interactive these nodes are with each other. Because moving one doesn't just shape it, it shapes how it blends into all the others. Like if we take the highs and pull it back, it starts to get reshaped by where the mids and the lows are. So now you've got overlapping frequencies, and you start coming up with some really interesting kind of sounds just by pulling where the highs bandwidth starts. Now you've got something like a pull it way down, Just by pulling that highs, you can go from a more modern metal through an uglier kind of thrash sound almost into a stoner, more doom, thicker type of distortion. So these make a huge amount of difference. The same thing happens with the low end. You know, if I pull this thing up here, see how it immediately gets shaped by where the mids are. If I bring the mids up and pull the highs, see how the curves kind of meld into each other and create a different curve than kind of like a graphic where you're just going to get affectation in one area. That's different from any other unit I've seen so far, in that you've got so much interplay in between those three bands that you're going to come up with a lot of things that you wouldn't normally expect. Now, the EQ down here is at the tail end of all this. This affects all the different bands. So it's kind of like, here's your core sound, and then here's dialing it in a bit more. I won't go over it too much. It's pretty self-explanatory. I just dialed in a little bit up on top to give it some clarity, you know, just a fine amount. And I didn't mess with it too much, but you can get, you know, some pretty massive boosts out of this with... So you're not going to run out of sound options here. So it's pretty plentiful, and that's a cool thing to see. Now let's check out the next screen where we're going to look at the speaker simulation. I've got a pretty traditional setup here where I've got a 57 and a 121 going on. Now the principal mic for me is the 121, and I'm actually going to move this to center because I tend to prefer mics pretty straight on. I'll leave the dynamic off a little bit here, or the 57 rather, because that's kind of the secondary or a detail mic. You have a number of different options that you can run through. Let's turn this one off and just run and see what we can get just by changing up the mic a little bit. Add in the 57. So you can come up with a ton of combinations. Again, I'm not going to go through all the different possibilities, though there are a lot of them. For me, the big thing here is load custom IR. This is where I feel like you're going to be able to carve out things if you really want to go on a tone journey somewhere or do some real exploring. Being able to pull in your own IRs is huge for me. I've mentioned it on a couple other videos, but having closed box architecture, I can't stand. Being limited into a certain sound that's kind of predetermined and the boundaries are already set. I love that this is here, and you've got it on both sides. So being able to pull in two other IRs that are individual to you, some cabinets or something you love, or IRs from other companies and things, and pulling them in, and then being able to shape them with the Parallax engine. That's where I feel like a lot of times you're going to hear something a lot more individual, and where somebody's going to come up with a tone that you might be really surprised to hear came out of the Parallax. So huge thumbs up for that. A lot of respect on them offering that option and making it so that this software is expandable beyond just its own interface. Okay, so that's going to wrap this one up. Appropriate links below, and as always, share, like, subscribe, all that kind of thing. Leave me some comments. If you've come up with some really interesting tones, please share them. Link up to them, link to your videos, any of that type of stuff. I'm always interested to hear what other people are doing with some of this stuff. So there's going to be a couple more demos coming up later in the week, and some more metal-based microscope is going to be starting up again here soon too. So I appreciate you watching as always. I'll see you on the next one.